Welcome to this episode of the Mantle Intergenerational Dialogue Forum on Transformative Leadership. It is my honor and privilege to introduce my first guest, who is an icon in the Kenya women's movement, whose immense contribution to the struggle for women's and gender rights is unquestionable. She is the executive director of Crown Trust, which is an organization that provides African women and girls with the tools, the voice, and platforms from which they can effect change at the individual, family, community, national, and continental levels in economic, social, and political spheres. She is a renowned champion for good governance and women's full inclusion in political processes. She is also a commentator and advocate on social justice, gender governance, and development. She is also an experienced civic educator who has remained at the forefront of the struggle for the implementation of the two-thirds gender principle in Kenya. I'm excited and glad to welcome Ms. Daisy Amdany to this show. My second guest is an academic and a consultant who is passionate about cultivating safe spaces for learning, reflection, and empowerment of women and the youth. She holds a PhD in international relations and is currently an adjunct faculty member at the United States International University, Africa, based in Kenya. She is the executive director of a multimedia platform rooted in the values of Pan-Africanism, using technology, training, convening, and empowering the youth. She has worked in Egypt and Kenya and has served as an advisor and consultant on youth empowerment and education matters. She has also served as a program director of a Pan-Africanist feminist collective whose mission is to foster, enable, and mobilize young women from Africa and the diaspora, while bringing the gap between policy and implementation, intergovernmental and grassroots, as well as generational spaces. It is now my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Syeda Hussain, and I'm your host, Maria Nzomo. I will start by asking you the same questions, but we start with Daisy. Regarding your core beliefs and principles, which define the way you think, because I'm sure you have some very strong views. So you speak from your own personal understanding of it, because you are already in your own right a leader. And indeed, I would ask an additional question, whether you consider yourself a transformational leader, and if so, why? And don't be shy about it.
Thank you so much, Professor Maria, and thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. So my core beliefs, I think it's as you've said, and that's one of the things that I learned first and foremost about leadership and being a leader, that you must learn how to lead yourself. And in being able to lead yourself, you've got to understand who you are. And so I think one of the first basics about a transformational leader is understanding that you are accountable. You're accountable. For me personally, I come from the perspective that at the end of this life, I will have to give an accounting. That innate understanding, the same way that we insist on accountability from other leaders. I don't think that this comes from nowhere. I think it is also because we have that understanding that ultimately we are accountable for this life that we live and the privilege of being in this life. If you don't know who you are, then you don't have a path that you are following. And it's not something that I have always known about it. And I think that's one of the privileges of the education that I had. So even as growing up and being in a convent school, I'm very grateful to the nuns because of that journey of self-discovery. Growing up, I was raised as a person, an individual with a purpose, and to learn how to have goals and to explore your strengths and pursue those. And that's what we were taught. And so there was never any limitation that was built into it. It was now when coming into the world that I encountered that discrimination on the basis of my being female. So I think that one of the core things about being a transformational leader is really understanding yourself, understanding your limitations, understanding your capabilities and harnessing those, and understanding that you are ultimately accountable to yourself and to the people that you would be leading. Whether it is in the home space, whether it is at organizational level, whether it is at national level as a leader, you do have a responsibility for that. And that leadership is actually service. So for me, a transformational leader is one who understands that they are there to serve, that they are accountable, and that you're accountable not just to yourself, but to other people. For me, that's really what it means. And accountability being one of the core factors, because you find that it's easy to theorize very many things. But even in terms of self-accountability, as you learn how to manage yourself, which I think is a part of a process, learning yourself, learning where you're strong, where you're not, where you need support, learning how to work with other people and bringing other people into that space so that you're able to do more together. I think that's really what transformational leadership is about. It's not a one-man show, or let me say one-woman show, one-person show. It is a collective effort.
Now, Re'em, is your turn. What are your, let's do it the same way. Your core beliefs, and then, of course, your view about the transformational leaders.
I think my core beliefs are pretty similar, but I think I'd like to focus more on like doing the work, like what, picking up what Daisy was saying about, putting the work in. I think there is a tendency, especially I think maybe my generation, to look for, that immediacy, right? And the goal and the agenda, it's not that there is no goal or agenda. The goal or agenda is that, you want that blue tick on Instagram or X or, things like that. You want to have created your brand, and that's the goal, right? So if that's the goal, there's no surprise why we're having some of the results we're having. But we really want to see, and I think like for transformational leaders, is people who are really putting in the work, right? Who are looking at like to map out like what is the ecosystem, where do I sit that I can make influence, and understanding that political process. I think it's really important to have leaders who are technically sound. We have many leaders, I think even historically, who speak, right? It's very easy to be the activist leader, right? Who'll be on TV, who'll be on radio, who'll be on Twitter, making noise, calling out government, calling out people. But do we have people who are then technically sound to understand what are the processes to make that change? Do you understand how to make, like, what is the process for policy change? How do you work with now your MP that you're complaining about to ensure that and keep track on the laws that they're passing? And how do you then also, how do you navigate as a movement and create community and turn that community into a movement that can then organize and create change? So I think it's about putting in the work, not wanting to be recognized, but not everyone's going to be president, right? Not everybody is going to be, and if it's women, right, that like the first woman to do looking for those like bios, right? But it's like, are you going to be that woman to hold the handbag of that woman who's going to be president, right? And help her strategize to find spaces, to lobby in conversations, to speak her name so that we can, create change in different spaces. So it's about, it's putting in the work. It's about being technically sound, once you have that platform. Because nowadays you get the platform by being viral.
When you say putting in the work,
yeah.
What do you mean exactly?
So it's about being in community. I think it's important to first start with being in community. So if we're looking at, just, politically, like political leadership, right? Mm-hmm. If you're running to be MCA of whichever, area, are you in community? Do you know what the issues are? Do you have a track record of working in that community on their issues? That's what we want to see. We don't want to see, children of privilege who are coming up and now want to enter politics, and they have the money, the backing, and the platform, and then they're not with community, right? So it's really, and I think that this is what, when you're speaking about now what needs to happen, it's as us, as as a Kenyan, or even as an African, or even a global citizen, it's for us to be really connected, not just focusing on the presidential seats. It's local government, and even below local government, before we even get to local government, are you understanding party politics? Because the people who are going to run are going to have to go through the party politics, right? There are a lot of, especially young women in Kenya, who are in political parties, who get locked out of being able to officially stand because of party politics, based on gender discrimination within those, and violence, right, within those politics. So it's about us. I remember, like, when I was growing up, so I came from a matriarchal family, but thinking now when I'm older, being like, why would matriarchal? Yeah, it was a matriarchal family. But seeing my grandmother and my mother being very involved in the party politics, but now understanding, then I went through a phase for, no, change happens outside, right? So we have to be the active outside, but not understanding that, no, we must be inside. If we're not in these political parties creating change and, speaking, supporting young women who are vying for politics, if we're not in the institutions, so if we're not applying, so, for technocrats, applying for different government positions to be at those desks, which we can play out, immigration, or, wherever it is, if we're not promoting women into the police force, if we're not strategically doing that and supporting women to be within the institutions to create that change, and we are only focusing on being outside and speaking at the institution, that's not how change is going to happen. Because it's very easy to, to block us out, right? So we have to strategically and put in the work to get into the institutions, to provide the support for the young women who are in the institutions to be able to be consistent, so holding them accountable as well, but also being a support system for them, because these institutions are very violent institutions. They're not institutions built for women. So how do we then support those women when they're in there and hold them accountable in a way that we're not, oh, you did this and I don't disagree with you, bye, I'm done with you, I'm canceling you. But how do we hold their hands and be like, hey, what's going on? Why have you changed your policy? Why have you changed? Why it seems that your values are changing? How can I support you to to enable you, to empower you, to stand with you, to hold your values? So in a nutshell, that's what I think. Yeah.
What about yourself? Would you call yourself a transformational leader?
I think I'd call myself the transformational leader that will hold the handbag. So I'm not the transformational leader. I'm not the one who will stand there for president, but I'm the one who will hold the handbag of the young woman who will stand for president.
And that's all you want to do?
Yeah, I want, because I like to be in different spaces. Once you're in that,
because leadership in very many spaces, like you say, it's not necessarily political. Yeah. Okay. If you had to advise our voters, in terms of preparation before the next elections, and they are groping in the dark and they are saying, we don't have leaders in this country, where are we going to choose from? What would you be telling them?
I would be telling them, one, they've got to decide what it is that they want, and that they need to stop self-sabotaging, because we've got to understand, and I think it was Johnny Carson, the former ambassador, who said, choices have consequences. This is something that we keep telling when we do civic education, when we do voter education, helping people understand that the sovereign power to change is with you. Every 5 years, we are given the opportunity to make a difference for Kenya, to make a sovereign choice. And what do? For the most part, we sell our birthright. I would tell them that we've got to change our mindset about what Kenya is. Because when we make our decisions based on tribe, then the only qualification that you need from me is for me to be from that tribe. I don't have to be a person of integrity. I don't have to be capable. I don't have to do anything. It is just that I belong to that tribe. And then we complain later on when they don't deliver. Because Kenyans, as assuredly as the sun will rise each day, every time they vote, within the year, they already begin to complain about the choices that they make. So it's really about understanding who we are as a people, what we want. We've got to decide who we want. It's, as I always, one of the things I always tell my son, before you do anything out there, you've got to determine who you are. Who are you and what do you want? And then your actions must then correspond to that. You can't say you want good leaders and then for 50 shillings, which even today it won't even buy you a loaf of bread. Yeah? You choose somebody based on that 50 bob. So you've sold your birthright for 50 shillings. So for that immediacy, you've got to if you've got to stay the course, and it's easier said than done, because we've been doing this for years and Kenyans just keep doing the wrong thing, expecting a different result and just getting the same bad results.
Yes, yeah, but we must continue this.
For me, I've decided I'm not giving up. I'm not, even if
that should be the spirit.
As they tell us, noise makers, it is okay. It's okay. I will make that noise, but tomorrow you'll remember that noise. You'll say, oh, by the way, that person, she was right when she said this. Somebody will pick it up.
Let's now turn to the one topic I know is of interest, this question of the implementation of the 2/3 gender rule. I can see Daisy smiling. This is one area I know she's very happy about. And I want you to maybe tell our viewers in your own way, what actionable political and social measures need to be put in place to reinforce the legal framework, because we have a legal framework. It's not like we are looking for one. We just needed a mechanism to help us implement.
We need to have a serious political cost to not implementing the 2/3 gender principle. The reason I say this is because for as long as there is no political cost to shortchanging women, we're not going to see any movement in that direction. Now, you recall the journey to a new constitutional order. Mm-hmm. For the longest time, it was talk. There was talk and there was effort and there was sabotaging of those efforts until Kenya came to the brink of destruction. And we were staring into the abyss of annihilation as a country and as a nation. And so finally, people were now willing to have a serious conversation about how then do we deal with the issues that are brought us to where we were. So, how do we have a more inclusive society? How do we ensure, that more people are feeling involved, that you feel part and parcel of this country? And of course, then the journey towards the 2/3, the implementation of the 2010 Constitution. Because remember, we had the Bomas Conference, we had the Bomas draft.
And another Bomas.
We had the Wako draft, we had a referendum, just the same political games that we're seeing around the 2/3, the implementation of the 2/3, where there's stated commitment, but no action, and structured impunity around it, where we say that we're a country of constitutionalism and the rule of law, and then we break every law, in ensuring that we don't do what is required, or the leadership doesn't do what is required, because there's no cost to shortchanging women. We came close to having that cost when now retired Chief Justice Maraga issued an advisory for the dissolution of Parliament. And that sent shockwaves, throughout the country. It was like, what? However, we did not sustain it. We didn't sustain it. We allowed the culture of impunity in Kenya to go unchallenged, and we let it go. And so here we are again. If you recall, now President Ruto, in his first year in office, barely 2 months into office, he wrote to Parliament, telling Parliament, you need to take this thing seriously. Remember, there's a dissolution order against Parliament. So that's political cost. But you see, we've not harnessed that. We've not harnessed that. Women are still quite happy to dance with Ruto. Remember his campaign promises. 50% of my cabinet will be women. I will enforce the 2/3 gender principle. I will do this, for nothing is happening, but nobody's taking him on. So that's what needs to happen. We are full of court orders, and the court has affirmed and reaffirmed this. We've done what needs to be done in terms of following through on the law. I'm co-chair of the multi-sectoral working group on the realization of the 2/3, the framework for the 2/3. We were gazetted by the Cabinet Secretary for Gender. We've delivered our report to her. She submitted it to Parliament. It is supposed to be part of the NADCO talks. Parliament has unveiled the NADCO bills. 2/3 is nowhere among them. They are just giving us funny stories. It's like you go here, you go there, shifting goalposts. So for me, the thing is we need to exact a political cost, because that's the only thing that the politicians will respond to. And what does a political cost look like? It looks like women rising up and saying we will not be forced to renegotiate our rights, because they come and say, oh, it's too expensive. We did a study that proved the cost is negligible. But hey, guess what? The president wants to bring in CASs. That's not too expensive. They're discussing creating new offices for the official opposition. In fact, official opposition and 2 deputies, prime cabinet secretary. These are not expensive. Why? Because it gives them the political tools the constitutional tools to handle their political problems. Women are not exacting that. We seem afraid. So for me, that's the actionable thing. Can we mobilize? Can we build enough of groundswell as women and say, if we don't get the 2/3 gender principle framework, and we've given them the framework, by the way, we did the report, we developed the instrument, so they don't even have to do the work. They just need to take and implement. We even did the public participation. We can do it. The problem is, are we united enough? Do we believe that it's possible? Do we believe in the cause to be able to exact that kind of political cost? Look at what brought Kenya Kwanza to the talking table. Maandamano. That's what political cost
If you
looks like.
bring in the factor that women, like men, are also heterogeneous, they have divided loyalties between their various classes to which they belong, their age, and religion is a factor. Political ideology, what you are calling unity, can it survive diversity?
I think it can, if you are able to help them see the vision of what it is that unites us. Because, and I say this, that we need to learn from the men. What is it that unites us? Think about, let's take the journey from 2013, right? We had Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto come together. They were from totally different political persuasions. A few years before, they had been fighting about the ICC trying to, put each other, each respective one in the dock, until they found that they had a common problem, the ICC. In trying to dig the hole for the other, they each fell into the same hole. And now they needed to come out of that hole together. So they had that problem. And that's what united them. We later on found out, just a few years later, that actually they were not united in terms of their political ideology, but they had a common problem that they came together to solve. If we are able to do that as women, cross generations, young people, understanding that from the days of Phoebe Asio, you remember that even I got into this movement when I was yet still a youth, even by constitutional terms. Today, the young people say, these old women like Akina Daisy. In fact, the first time I heard that, I was like, when did I become old? So until we realize that we have a common destiny, We have a common problem, because even in terms of our ethnicity, when you look at tribe and culture, tradition and practice, there is no single tribe that does not have oppression and exclusion mechanisms for women. There is no religion that does not have oppressive and exclusionary principles for women. So it doesn't matter what tribe you're from, each tribe in your tribe, whether you are, it doesn't matter. You're excluded not because you are of that tribe. You're excluded because you are a woman. You're oppressed because you're a woman. The religion will come and tell you you can't teach, you can't represent the religion because you're a woman. And this is across the board. These are the Muslims are fighting it. The Christians are fighting it. Do we even have religions where they have women who are leaders? I don't know. Maybe we make our own. I'm just saying that if we can recognize this as women, it doesn't matter whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you are from which ethnicity, there is a united approach in excluding and oppressing women. And the minute that we understand that, we should be able to build unity around that. There's nothing. We talk about elite and grassroots women. Are there no men in the grassroots? Who talks about elite and grassroots men? There's nothing like that. But they're there. Because where women are, men are. How do we not? Why do we agree to be divided that way? Everybody engages in their sphere of influence. So if you're at the national, if you're at the county, if you're at the grassroots, you engage in your sphere of influence. So we've got to build that vision as women to come together. And we've been able to do it because, remember, what we cite as women's gains in the Constitution 2010 came about as a result of women, so-called elite and grassroots women, working together and understanding you have common problems. It's only that you are crying in Lavington and this one is crying in Madare, but you are crying, both of you, and you're crying because you are women. So we need to be able to build that solidarity. And if we do that, there's nothing that will stop us. And so that's what we've got to work towards. That's what we're trying to work towards.
Yeah, Reem, let's just assume tomorrow we hear Parliament finally has passed this, and it is now just waiting for the normal process of enforcement. Yeah. So now we have the numbers, and we are thinking about these numbers being the basis for building transformative leadership. Because if you are not leading, then there is nothing which is going to change, Daisy, just because we have the numbers. Do you see that happening?
I think two things need to happen. We need to stop thinking about change in numbers, because there is a tendency for us to think, okay, if we have protest, and that's how change is going to happen. To understand that the system that we're up against, when we're saying it's a system that is governed by policies and laws, right? Whether they're constitutional or unconstitutional, it's designed to do exactly what it is doing, right? So for us to create change or to create transformational leaders or transformational policies, we have to understand that that protest, the numbers, is part of a process to create the change. So the other thing that needs to happen that is not happening, then for me, I think it's because of this, romanticization of how change happens, that it'll happen with the banners and the graffiti and the artists and the protests and the numbers on the streets. But we haven't documented the part where you have young people sitting outside Parliament, ensuring that the policies that they want to change happen. And sitting outside in Parliament, not in terms of bodies just sitting outside Parliament, it's about minds sitting outside of Parliament, who understand the policies that are being debated, who organize in a way that they become a lobby group, which means that they know how to systematically be a part of the system to change those policies. And this is not just something that's happening at the national level, it's happening at the multi-institutional level as well. Gender as an agenda is being left out. It was left out this year at CSW. Mm-hmm. The reason it got in, some of these like SRH, the language on SRHR, and bodily autonomy and different things, the reason it got in was because young people sat outside the meeting rooms, which were closed, understanding what the negotiation process, we're able to then lobby to ensure that the language changes within the room. It is something that's happening now. So this week in Nairobi, Kenya is hosting the CSO conference for the Summit of the Future to revitalize the United Nations. It's having, again, young people sitting, again, outside rooms that are closed for a reason, but understanding how the negotiations happen, understanding the technicality of the language that is going to go into the pact. So having young people then at the national level doing the same thing. So how do we enable young people, enable young women, train them to be able to sit and watch Parliament, but not just watch it. How do we have them trained to be able to lobby around to ensure that those policies are changed? Because I remember, I don't know if it still happens, I don't watch TV, but Parliament is broadcast live, right? How do we use that as a tool? Like, we don't just, sit and watch and wait to see this one parliamentarian falling asleep, but to understand the policies that are being discussed and how do we change it, right? So what is the process for that policy to be created to be read at Parliament? So for a position to be read at Parliament, what is happening? And how do we strategically place ourselves as networks, as groups, as individuals along that pathway to then ensure that what we want to be read in Parliament is read, what we want to pass in Parliament is passed, and then have the accountability mechanisms to ensure that it is implemented, right? So then how do we work with the judiciary to ensure that, what they passed is then implemented? But then I think what's important is that we come together in solidarity, right? So there's so many, I think, like women's groups, if it's like a group of like lawyers or politicians or, policymakers, academics as well, really need to get organized and figure out where they stand in this ecosystem and like what is their agenda and how are they important for social change, right? How do we then recognize our individual powers to then organize and come together as opposed to competing, right? With donors coming in, it's again, this very like clickbait, we want again to be seen as the organization that is pushing this, or to be seen as this like one female woman leader, young woman leader, or older woman leader who's pushing this agenda, so that we create our legacy. Yeah. But how do we go beyond that and beneath that to really thinking and having, I really like what you said in the beginning about having, what is your agenda, right? And having that and that link to your values, and how is that your guide? So you're constantly being like, this is my agenda, this is my guide. And you can see it. You can see in the leaders whose agenda is just to be the populist, right? To be the popular one. You can see it, right? But then how do we then hold them accountable? Like, okay, because you're popular, you have access to that space. So you are called onto these platforms. You are called into these rooms. Now that you're in the room, I'm going to support you. I have the technical knowledge to support you with, the policies, the language. This is the speech to read, right? This is what you need to push. I'm not saying don't have access to that space. If you want access to that space, have access, but I will support you. I'll write your speech, right? Because we're also seeing the tendency for young people to, be invited to spaces to perform this very passionate, activist sort of role, right? But how do we then, for those young people who are already situated in those spaces, how do we, get hold of them, these young women, and say, okay, I've seen your platform that you've created, which is amazing, right? Let me support you with this agenda. Let me provide you with that policy support, but also financial support. When we're talking about young women or women entering into be a part for this 2/3 policy, are we funding young women to be able to run, to be able to get those seats? Because if we're not, they're not going to get into those seats. Because the men are funded to be in those seats, but women are not funding women to be in these seats. So are we putting out and investing, right? So investing is not just investing them in terms of I'm going to show up and vote, or I'm going to show up and provide them with the technical knowledge, but are we going to financially put our money into these young women?
And you have repeated young women, youth several times. Is this to suggest that the kind of leadership you are looking for is going to come primarily from the youth? Of course, female youth to start with. And I want to also ask an additional one, which even Daisy can chip in. Are women necessarily better than men in attaining the desired positive change in all these areas of transformation, human development, issues of human rights, peace and security, etc. Would you make a sweeping statement that if you have enough numbers, then you have started to resolve the problem of leadership?
I mean, I definitely do privilege the youth. Our continent is blessed, I think, with being, our population is majority youth. So I think automatically when we're thinking about the pool of leadership and we're thinking about numbers, right, it's going to come from young people. They have to be. We cannot have a population of young people led by 80-year-old, 90-year-old men.
Yes.
Okay, so definitely is. But I think we're also moving beyond, as young people, moving beyond just intergenerational spaces to multi-generational spaces.
Yes.
We have adolescent, amazing adolescents who understand policy now entering this space. And of course, the generation above me, I know we had a debate of what they are, X, I think, or no, we're Y, so they are X, right? Them, like, what is their space? And they're the technocrats, right? So Generation X are all sitting in these technocratic spaces. They're, in government, they're in these spaces. But it's young people, yes, to lead multi-generational spaces and to co-lead, right? So not just to lead, to co-lead. So for the older generation, the luminaries, for them to come together with young people and be like, how can we support you? And a lot of the times the support is, that technical knowledge or the process, you understand the system better than young people coming in because you've been in it for longer. So you're able to pinpoint and be like, no, this is actually how the system works. And young people can then come in and innovate, right? We can use tech, we can use, even art, even though I try to move away from this very developmental sort of glorification about art and what art can do, right? But we have ways to organize, to mobilize that can then support to dismantle and recreate these systems that we want. And I think what's really empowering, just seeing what's happening globally, is the older generations honestly have failed us, right? My generation as well has failed us. We're seeing X, Y, Z, right? Z leading in the US, leading the demonstrations and the call for a ceasefire and an end to the occupation. So even in terms of language, right? You have maybe my generation, the generation older than me, simply calling for a ceasefire. But young people understanding, right, that it's not a ceasefire that we're calling for decolonization, which is something that we would expect from older generations who understand that this is a system of colonization, right? Even within in Kenya as well. But there's something that has happened, I don't know, along the way where, I don't know, something, I'm not going to say, maybe you can say what has happened along the way, that the older generations are maybe hesitant to use some of this very unapologetic language, right? So young people are very unapologetically Afrocentric. We're not afraid to say and to center our knowledge and our history and our agency. Young people are not afraid to use the language of decolonization, are not afraid to use the language of Pan-Africanism, to even call out and hold into account very influential Pan-African leaders. Young people have called out Nelson Mandela and the telling of his story, right? Young people have called out Sankara and asked, well, why aren't we talking about Mariam Sankara? Why don't we know her? Yeah, like why did her story get lost? So it's using that passion and that audacity of the younger generation, supported and co-led by older generations, being mindful that as we're talking about adolescence, another generation is coming in. So how do we create systems that allow for this multi-generational co-leadership with accountability being the thread through it? So if we're not going to be accountable to, the Almighty, we will be accountable to the next generations. Because, for instance, for me, as we celebrate, older generations who protected Karura Forest, I question protecting it for who when access to Karura Forest is it 100 shillings for Kenyan citizens, and which citizens are those? The privileged who can afford it. So to what extent was Karura Forest protected and is a celebration of protection of our environment for Kenyans? Which Kenyans are we talking about?
There you are, Daisy. What's your view? You're being told you are not audacious enough. You lack the courage of conviction to carry this journey forward.
I think there's, one of the things I said is that you've got to be able to build stamina and consistency. And I do think that people do get tired along the way, that fatigue. And so young people, are very energetic and, that's it's a process. It's a process of life. However, I do believe that it has to be intergenerational. The answer does not lie in one generation, because you are young today, you will not be young tomorrow, But there are certain things that you will always be. You will always be a woman, whether you are young or old, you will always be a woman. So I do think that we must understand that we all need each other, that we're in this together, We're not going to get rid of our older people. I mean, that is just like time does that for you. But for as long as they're there, they're useful. The young people are useful. How do we bring what everybody has together so that we build towards a common goal, a more equal, participatory, and inclusive society? Okay, it's about inclusivity, and it's about every voice counting, right? Because not everybody can be there, but we do need to have representation of everybody. Okay, and that's why people feel excluded, because if you make it entirely about the older people, the younger people feel left out. If it's just the younger people, the older people feel left out and they feel useless. The disabled are there, the people who are differently abled. So I think that we need to have clear perspective. And when you were talking about the older generation, that we cannot be led by old 90-year-old men. But I immediately I thought about the case of Malaysia, where the young people actually settled on an old man over 90, but listening to him. Mahathir Mohamad, listening to him, his clarity of thought, his vision for the future. So you can't wish that kind of leadership away. It is valuable and it is precious. And the people understood that. But he also understood his limitations. And so he was willing to lead for a time and walk away, and say, I'm going to hand it over. But he was useful in terms of making that transition into change. So I think that we've got to look at what our resources are. And so there's no, let me say this, there's no silver bullet, right? So we can't say, we must be careful to not to direct it towards, to make it purely generational, or to make it purely gender-based, where we talk about women, saying that, yes, we need more women because women are better. We're not advocating for role reversal. We're talking about shared spaces, because women have different perspectives and their voices need to be on that table so that we have a wide perspective. We need the younger people, right? Because the younger people have different experiences. You can't assume that just because you were young, therefore you know what it is to be young. You were young in a different generation. I was just yesterday, I was talking to some of my staff. A lot of my staff are really young people. And I was telling them about how Kenya worked at one time, that we had a functioning transport system, that issues of water, we didn't have anything like water shortage, power shortage, garbage used to be collected. You could organize yourself around the transport system. And for them, it's a totally foreign world because they've never known a Kenya like that. So we have a generation that has absolutely no idea that government can actually deliver services. Then they know matatus, chaotic, and think of that as a public transport system, yet it's not. So I'm just saying that our experiences differ in terms of the generations that we're living in. So it's important to have those voices so that we understand where each one are coming from, and then we're able to build a more holistic picture. So, and that's one of the things I always tell women. We must not encourage the phrase which says what a man can do, a woman can do better. No. we can do this together. We really need to have those shared, we need the shared space so that we have the different perspectives. One of the things that is unique to women is that women's perspective, or their perspective of self, is, for the most part, is bigger than the individual. When women think of themselves, they think about their children. They think about their husband. They think about their parents. That's how women think about themselves. That's why whenever we give the example of, if you were to give a man a certain amount of money and you were to give a woman the exact same amount of money, how they would use it. The woman, for the most part, would use it to address the needs of those around her, because she cares for those. So when her mother is safe and cared for, when her parents are okay and her children are okay, she's okay, for the most part. And for the men, and no offense to the men, it's really about the individual. I think it was somebody, I don't know if it was here, where somebody said that, when men become wealthier, they increase the wives, they get new wives, they upgrade. And we've seen that, in practical terms. It's not all of them that do it, but we've seen them doing it. But so what are we saying? Even by way of example, when we look at from the time the first election under the new constitution that brought in the highest number of women ever in Kenyan leadership, we saw for the first time legislation that had been doing the rounds in Kenya since the 70s. Marriage Act, protection against domestic violence, food security, addressing social issues, domestic issues, property issues. Through their lived experiences, we began to see.
And mind you, there were only 6 women
Yes.
who actually, they were a big number at that time, but they did a lot in that.
And changed things, even the perspective. Today, we talk about the government ensuring sanitary towels for everybody. But you remember when it became a conversation, like, you cannot bring those dirty things into this house and be like, why is it dirty? These are the lived realities. Girls and women menstruate because they're girls and women. They need this support and everything. Today, it has become a normal conversation. If we had no women in the house, that is not a conversation. Pads were taxed as luxury goods. I remember one of the women members of parliament telling me that one of the men came to her and said, "You mean you can't turn this thing off?" She was like, "What do you mean?" It's like, if you just can't decide you don't want to. And she was like, "No, it's a monthly thing. Like, it happens to you, it happens because you're." But imagine that they thought it's like, these women are like extra, they just want to bleed around, that you can turn it on and off. So now bringing that perspective into development, because leaders were not understanding that for those girls who cannot afford the sanitary towels, they would have to miss school for the days that they're menstruating. So cumulatively, you have girls missing up to a month of school because of lack of access to sanitary towels. And of course, that then affects how girls get education. So, and what is the overall impact? So imagine that's what women bring, because they deal with those nuances, those personal things. So having the voices of women on the leadership and decision-making table is vital for development, budgeting, and bringing, a wider perspective. And I like what Professor Wanjiku Kabira always says: what's good for women is good for everyone. So it's not just about women, because women care about society and community, because that's how they think of themselves.
Yeah, in getting to the end now of this, but I cannot stop before I get Daisy and Reem. Of course, you can chip in to respond to this quote that I picked from one of her many speeches, where she said, you are being interviewed. I can't remember who was interviewing you. He said, Kenyans cannot elect thugs to government and then get shocked when they steal. And now we are now talking about all Kenyans, including women, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So how do we ensure that we don't elect thugs into government. That's one. And two, is electoral politics the only way or the only source of finding transformative leaders?
So I'll start with the last question. Is elective office the only way? It is not. In fact, I think that we need to start thinking of leaders also outside just the political, because we have leaders everywhere in the home. We have in the corporate world. We have leaders in the education sector. We have leaders everywhere, okay? And we need them to start playing an active role, a more active role in terms of contributing to how we're shaping perspectives of what leadership is. Because we've given such prominence to the political that nothing else is seen as leadership if it's not political, right? Yet we have so many levels of leadership, and like in fact, for me, all my examples of transformative leaders are not political. They're not politicians. They engage with the political space, but they are influencing from different angles. And that's what we need to see. That while it's important to be inside to make a change, but you can also make a change from the outskirts, because it also feeds into that. Business feeds into the politics, academia feeds into the politics, community, social life feeds into the political. So if we build leaders, if we encourage the leadership around those areas, I think we will have better outcomes in terms of the political leadership, because then we begin to determine then what is acceptable and what is not. Can we stop thugs from getting into office? We've tried. We actually have a whole chapter 6 in our constitution on leadership and integrity, where we have set the standard for what leadership is. For me, I think it's really about accountability. We must not be afraid. We need to understand that as citizens, our role doesn't end with just voting, okay? You've got to be involved. In fact, I think that we are lazy in our interactions. If I were to take a poll, even just here among us, how many of us are members of political parties? You'll find that perhaps actually we are not, right? So our engagement with the electoral process is at the tail end, because the general election is the end of the process. It's not the process. The bulk of the process takes place in the political parties and in the primary process, where, as Reem, you said, women are casualties. Women and young people are casualties. First of all, political parties, they build in mechanisms that make it difficult. Nomination fees, making it very difficult. They're very violent acts, so people are afraid to get in. People are terrified of these processes. How do we then clean it up from inside? How do we make sure that we're part of these processes? How do we make sure that these processes are fair and just enough to allow us to feed that pipeline? Because how that pipeline is fed is really, really important. When you're going into the booth to vote at the general election, that pipeline has already been fed. You have the results. So now you're like, now who are these people? And you start, look at the 2022 elections. We actually had more people who didn't vote than voted. The majority of registered voters didn't engage with the process because they were very dissatisfied with the process. But how many of us are actually participating in that process? But you see, we are lazy. Actually, let me say this, we are lazy. We do training, public participation, but when public participation is called, people don't show up. And so we allow other people to engage. So we have to be active citizens. The only way we ensure that thugs are not getting into this process is to be active citizens and to participate in those processes. Go and become a member of the political party that has a semblance of an ideology that you can live with, and then work your way in there. Do what we are doing, because we support women. We support women to get into these spaces, and we support them. We support them with meetings. We support them. I agree, the support may not be enough, but we do try our best. And then we build also support for them. We encourage others to be part of the process. Then when they're elected, our engagement now must be heightened. We must make sure we're holding them accountable. We must make sure that
they are setting the agenda to start with.
this setting the agenda, we need to do it before, because we've got to agree. If I'm saying, Maria, I will support you, but this is our agenda when you get there. Then when you get there and you start saying, hey, me, I have to build my house first. I have to, because when you talk to some of them, they will say, when you say what capacity building, money management. No, please be doing that in your spare time, but let's talk about your legislative agenda, how we're going to build your capacity to be effective and all. And I'm saying this, because there's, I will not name the person, but one of our sisters in the movement who actually not even to parliament, to one of the county assemblies, was nominated, and then we now were going to do 2 years later, around that county, to just do an assessment. And I spoke to her and I said, so, what has been your experience in this, and I'm sure you can subtitle this. Because she said to me, wow, Daisy, kazi imenisaidia. And okay, let me just say it even in English. This job has really, really helped me. I finished building my house. Now I have a hardware. In fact, my husband is the one who runs the hardware, and we get good tenders from the county. So now I want to go to be woman rep. This county is one of the counties that has the highest number of teen pregnancies. SGBV against women and girls, and so there was nothing about that. Yet these were the things that we were championing.
It's not a transformation.
Exactly, but you see, we position ourselves as such. We talk the talk, but we don't walk the talk. But the challenge also becomes those of us who are out here, we don't hold them accountable for ensuring that they do walk the talk. And if they don't, then what are the consequences? What are then the consequences to that? How do they, when you cease to be an accountable leader, how do we mobilize against you? Because there has to be penalties.
It's in the Constitution, David.
The recall. Yes. Did you see the legislation that they passed on the recall clause? They made it close to impossible. Even the courts said, this law cannot be, it's not useful. So I do think, that there are mechanisms, and that we just cannot give up. We cannot give up on the agenda. And for me, I've decided, even if I will be the lone voice, I will be there. As in, I'm not going away. Until the day that Yahweh decides to call me home, I'm not going anywhere. So, and that's the thing, because they keep seeing me, it got to a point where they would see me on TV and they'll be like, she's just going to talk about the 2/3. I'm like, yes, until we implement. Like, if you want me to stop talking about it, let's implement. Then we can talk about 50-50. We can talk about other things. So we've just got to be persistent like that.
Re'em, do you have something to add to that before we close?
No, I think I'd just like to add, I think, something that we're also maybe missing is when we support, whichever leader is transformational leader into politics, right? What happens, if they don't make it, right? Citing Honorable Martha Karua, right? I think there's a lot of narrative around, her running mate, but it's what happened to her? And there's a lot of even, psychosocial support that needs to be, especially for women who don't make it into politics, right? Do we discard them? And I think usually we do. We discard them, we forget about them, okay, you didn't make it, now let's look for someone else. But how do we continue to support, right? So when we're saying we're investing in women in politics, or we're investing in transformational leaders, right? And transformational leaders who are not women, and I think even women, right, is we're looking at the values, right? Do they hold feminist leadership values, right? Regardless of your gender. But how do we continue to support them even when they're outside of politics, or if they don't make it, and still plug them into spaces so that they're still, have value? Because there's a lot of investment has gone into them and opening up spaces and, capacity and enabling. But how do we not lose that, I think, is really important, so that we don't lose people in society. I think there is also, when we're talking about an instant society where people, come up, it's also instant in terms of people, disappear as well, right? So how do we also not lose people that we have identified are really transformational?
Now that you still have the floor, would you like to make a few closing remarks?
And I think it's important for us to organize. So I think my organizing brain is now like, hey, Daisy, so I hear that,
Yeah.
you have an in with Parliament. How can we like strategize now? And I think it's like really promoting that and being like, like I said in the beginning, it's like putting in the work. How do we, get our hands dirty and really in there and see like, pull together our networks, our expertise, to create, some of the processes and policies, also, bigger networks and collectives that we can ensure like some of the policies and that we want and leaders that we want are in these spaces.
Daisy, you have the last word.
We've got to catch that vision and work towards it. And we've got to be determined. We've got to be focused. And we cannot give up, because these systems, it's also about the deconstruction of the systems. The systems are designed to oppress and to tire you out, to exhaust you so that you give up. So we can't. Even as we deconstruct, we've got to learn to build resilience in them and to work together, collectively. For me, I am excited. I'm excited about the possibilities. And so we cannot stop working towards ensuring that we see, even if it is in my lifetime, to have a glimpse of that possibility, that it's possible. Just like our freedom fighters. I mean, they were up against impossible odds, impossible odds. They were young. They didn't have anywhere near even the kind of organizing capacity that we have today and the tools that we have. But they dared. They dared. And we remember them today because they dared. They knew that there was a price to pay. So we've got to come out of that comfort zone. We've got to bring others out of that comfort zone. And we've got to fight to have all those voices on the table and see a different Kenya and a different Africa. We talk about Pan-Africanism. I think Africa is that last frontier, We can be the change that needs to happen in this world. And Kenya can lead with that. The same way we led with M-Pesa, we can also lead with the governance and the possible, what is possible.
Yeah, as always, Daisy is very positive about the future. And I'm sure our viewers have been really empowered, inspired at least by this conversation. I promise you they are not going to let us down. These are the change makers, the influencers that we are talking about, and they are not about to give up. They are not about to give up, although they are admitting that the journey is long and the challenges will be there. But it is the persistence, it is the commitment, it is the dedication, and moving with the spirit that one step at a time. It all adds up, and adding up will take us to where we want to go. Transformative leadership is not a choice we have. It is something we must achieve, not just here in Kenya, but on the continent and even globally. We need good global management of global public affairs. And we don't have those that should be leading it at this moment. So this is a job we have. We will do what we can in our lifetimes and then pass on the baton. But right now we are holding the mantle, and the dialogue must continue. I really want to thank my two guests once again. They have really done us what exactly we expected, got us to reflect and to think again about our standing aside, observing, blaming others, and not participating adequately, making our own contribution, because that is what is going to change everything. Having leadership start with us, before we ask it of others, or before we start talking about holding us to account. Thank you very much, viewers. Until next time. Thank you.